Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'll just give it a couple more minutes for the last few people to come in, and then we'll begin shortly. All right, so let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Nilesh Chatterjee, and I am the lead for this intro to research series that Mind the Bleep are now running. So thank you for joining us today. Um, with me, I'll give a bit of background about myself. Um, I'm a med student currently at St. George's University, and I've previously done a PhD. And joining me today are Dr. Jasdip Dulai, who's also completed his PhD recently, and we have Michelle Meng as well, who's just about to complete her PhD. And just to give you a brief overview of how this session will run, I'll first go through just the aims and objectives of the session and why it's important for people to learn about this. And we'll do a quick Mentimeter quiz after, and then one at the end of the webinar as well, just to have an idea of how much you've gauged and learned from the session. And throughout this point, feel free to ask questions or type questions in the chat, and we'll have time to go through those at the end, just so the flow of the presentation works a little bit better. Um, and if you have any questions, just put it in the chat. So let's begin with the quick little learning objectives we have, which is just understanding how you go about applying for a master's or a PhD and what type of funding is available for home and international students, because it does vary. And yeah, I'm sure you already knew that because it's pretty much in the name of the webinar. And a lot of you might be wondering, especially the med students here, why that's even important. Why do you care about um, applying for a PhD or a master's or even doing a postgraduate degree? And it's really because research is ubiquitous in medicine and you're going to need it at some point or the other. You can see a lot of my points say specialty points. And although you shouldn't really think about it in these terms, um, it is really important for specialty points and also for research as you go along in the future during your medical career. There's many different points you can do that. So during medical school, you can intercalate for a BSc, master's, or even a PhD if you want to go that far at that point. But you can also do it during clinical training. And a lot of the questions you asked before we started was to do with clinical training. So for that, it'd be really good if you joined the next webinar because that deals directly with doing a PhD during clinical training, whereas this is more about applying for it. So if we now just go and do a quick little Mentimeter quiz, let me just share that screen right now. Let's just have a look. Alrighty, so if you guys just go to menti.com and join using that link, once there's a few people joined in, we can start the actual quiz. It's very short. So I'll wait for some people. If you have a mobile device, it would be much easier on that as well. So I'll give this a couple of minutes because I know it takes a bit of time to get it going. Good. This at least means you can see my screen, which is always a good start. Give it a couple more minutes to get a few more people in. So one thing important with the questions here is that all the answers will seem correct, but there's one answer which is more correct than the others. So have a go for those ones. It's completely fine if you don't know the answers right now because you're not meant to. And hopefully the one after will do a bit better. Okay, just a few more people. I'll wait for them to join in. And just a warning right now, we may overrun slightly, so I'm really sorry about that in advance, but hopefully not by too much. Okay, we'll get started in a second. And when the answer options show up on your screen, you'll have about 10 seconds to put in the right answer. Okay, so let's begin. So yeah, there's no time rush here. So have a go. Yeah, I mean, you're doing really well, guys. Majority answer. So let's move on to the next one. You'll have a chance to. We'll go through all of these throughout the presentation as well. So don't worry if you didn't get that one right or any of the ones right now. Okay, so we'll chat a little bit about that. So let's move on to the next one. Yeah, good work, guys. Well done. So now we can jump right in. If I just share the slides again. So the person who's going to be talking about the master slides is our very own Michelle Meng. So Michelle, if you want to unmute, and we can begin.
Okie dokie. Sounds good. So in terms of applying for a master's degree, so for me personally, I did a master's in pharmacology. It was a one-year master's and it was split between a taught aspect, which is dealt with using lectures and practicals, and then the other half was a research project. So the first step that I would advise when thinking about doing a master's degree is whether you want to have a completely research-focused master's, which will involve a 9-month or so research project where you write up your thesis at the end of it, or if you want a taught element to it as well. There's a wide range of different masters that do different types. And the main ways that you can find the applications are usually through the university websites. And for me personally, I just went on findamasters.com and then I searched up pharmacology and then I looked up the different ones that were available. And then those took me to the university websites where I could find out more information about the breakdown of the courses, how it's marked at the end of it, what sort of research groups are there, and who I could do the research project at the end with. So yeah, I would start looking very early. My applications I sent off around the January time, and I started interviewing in January, February. So it is very early. So start making those applications the same time that you would when you're applying for your undergrad. I'd start looking around September time to see what you would want to apply to. It says to apply for as many as you want, but I would bear in mind that most of them, if not all applications, require you to pay a fee for your application. And that fee varies between different ones. So I think I paid maybe £50 to £80 for one of my applications. So just bear that in mind when you're looking through which ones you want to apply for. Also, you need to check your entry requirements. A lot of them will require that you have carried out a bachelor's or an undergraduate degree first before you apply to the master's. And also they will require academic references too, usually 2 to 3. And it would be highly useful to have those coming from people with an academic background. So not a work experience sort of thing, more of a professional reference. And then the next step to applying is that you have to create a personal statement or a CV. And so this personal statement should be driven by your research goals and your research focus and what you want to get out of the master's. And also any relevant research experience that you have, that is what the personal statement should be focused on, and things that you've experienced and what you're interested in terms of what sort of skills do you want to get out of the master's and why you're particularly interested in the topic that you've applied for too. It's always useful to mention any publications if you have any, whether it's a really small role or a lead author role. Really put the emphasis on that, as it shows that you've taken the lead in your own research and you know how to design your experiments and see where your research can fit into the field, and things like that. Also really important to look at the department where you'll be based and the different PIs and research groups that will be based in that department, as that's who you'll be likely to carry out your research project with, and see what their interests are and how they align with yours. And also, yes, relevant extracurricular things. So whereas during applying for an undergraduate degree, you might put more of a focus on things that are not directly related to science or research. Here you want to keep that to an absolute minimum, and focus on your more of your academic achievements. And finally, the interview. So for me, I can only speak personally from how my interview went, but it's very, very important to have a broad understanding of the fields that you're wanting to apply to, and read around different papers and things like that. So common questions will be, which publication have you read within the last 10 years that you think has made the biggest impact in the field, for example? And also criticizing relevant research that's been happening in the field. So it shows that you're aware of things that are happening recently, and how you would potentially make that research better. But as it says here, it is a conversation. They're not trying to test you or catch you out. They just want to know what your intentions are and how you're going to best fit into the degree, and into the course, and what you would like to get out of it. So it's just good to do a lot of reading in the literature so you have a good understanding and you're not caught off guard.
Yeah, thanks, Misha. And just to reiterate as well, it's not that you have to have huge amounts of research experience to go in and to be able to do the master's. It's just you have to be enthusiastic. And like we were saying, it's most important to have read around the field or the topic you're applying for, because that's really what they look for in the interview as well. Because I know a lot of people were saying in the form that you filled in before that you don't know where to start and you don't think you might have as much research experience. That's not a problem. Okay. And just going back to the Menti quiz, you wouldn't really include original ideas at this point because it is a master's degrees and the projects are a lot more structured. So that's why in point number 3, you can see you talk about your interest in the research projects being offered during your course, whereas original ideas are a bit more for PhD, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. So yeah, put questions in the chat and I'll have a look at them later. So if we move on to applying for a PhD degree, it's quite a bit of a step up in terms of difficulty. I know a lot of people said in the form they didn't know what to expect and how much effort it took. It is a lot more it is 3 years, 3 to 4 years of your life of doing mostly research. But applying for it is not actually that different from a master's. So again, you should start as early as possible because people are applying throughout the year for PhDs rather than masters, which can have a deadline, even though some do take applications on a rolling basis. But it's important to start early as well because it's hard to find supervisors willing to take you. So again, applications are done directly through the university website, although you can find opportunities elsewhere, like Find a PhD and other such websites which advertise PhDs and projects directly. And this is the most important first step, is really to find a supervisor and find a lab which is doing something that you're interested in. So when I did my PhD, I had my own project, and I scoured university websites to find a lab group that was doing something even remotely similar. And if they were, I went on to the next step, which you'll see. And like I've said, be creative. Um, Interviewers and PIs love to see that you have that initiative to try and be creative. And although you might feel like you don't have the experience to come up with a new research idea at the moment, if you read around fields that you're interested in, like cardiology or pharmacology, if you read the papers, you'll come up with some sort of idea like, oh, why aren't they doing this? And you can sort of build upon that and pitch it to your supervisor, which comes on to our next bit, where once you find labs that you're interested in or supervisors that you think might be great to supervise your project, you send them an email. It's unfortunate. It's kind of like cold calling, but that is the name of the game, unfortunately. You have to formulate a really nice email, which someone you think would be happy to read and willing to reply to. And the body of the email should be similar to a targeted personal statement, like why their lab is perfect for you and why you are a fit for their lab in terms of research and also interest of the lab. If you go on university websites and lab websites, it'll also have social things and outreach endeavors. So you can talk a little bit about those as well. And you want to send just one email because you don't want the supervisor to have to read through multiple emails. So include your CV in the email as well and your original research idea as a proposal if you have that. And we'll look through an example of Jazz's PhD proposal in the next slide, anyways, which he'll talk you through. And you should always try and conclude the email by inviting them for a meeting on Teams, on Zoom, or in person. I would always say in person is better, but that's just my bias. And then the last bit, well, the second to last bit is actually meeting the PI. And there's a few questions that you should really ask them. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a later on slide to do with interview tips and tricks. Um, but you should ask them whether they'll support your application to the university, because although you apply to a university, they're the ones who are going to be monitoring you and managing what you do, your project. If you need any help, they'll be the ones you go to. So it's really important, and you're much more likely to get in if they directly support your application when you make it. And yeah, the most important thing is asking for funding, and we'll reiterate that later on as well. So once you've done that, you've emailed 10, 20 labs, maybe 3 of them have gotten back to you about a meeting. That's, you might be demotivated by that, but that's pretty good. I remember emailing at least 15, 16 labs, and I think 2 of them got back to me. And well, one of them took me for my PhD. So it you don't need 15 out of 15 to reply. You just need the one. And then yeah, the last step is actually doing the application, filling it in at the right time. Yeah, if you just follow the steps and think of your personal statement, think of what makes you suited to do research, how original you are, any previous research experience. Like I was saying before, including relevant work experience. So as we said for the masters, but all that's important to PhD as well. Something that maybe shows organization or resilience, because you'll really need that through the entire process. Or I think all 3 of us can tell you that, and you'll hear more about that in one of our future webinars. You need to be able to show them you're resilient, and you can organize yourself. So the next slide Jas is going to talk about, it's a little excerpt from his research proposal. So he can just give you a quick overview of that. There's a lot on the slide, but don't worry about the actual details. It's more about the headings and kind of stuff that's important to include in your PhD proposal in the email. So Jas, if you want to take over.
Yeah, and so my pathway was very similar to Neil's. So I came up with a project idea, and it was kind of like a blend of what I've already done in my past, i.e., my undergrad, and where I wanted my career to go. So I want to go into industry, and I kind of bridged all the things I liked and where I could see original research beginning. And the tip I got from my undergrad supervisor was supervisors are very busy people. So you want to make their lives very easy, and all the information they need needs to be concise. So CV wise, chances are you don't have much to add. So 2 pages is normally sufficient, and you should be able to have it concise until you become an academic where you have multiple pages. And the same with a PhD proposal. So my proposal was 2 pages, plus a third page where I put the Gantt chart. So that bottom right figure is a Gantt chart. And that was just there so, people like to have figures. It just makes it easier. They can make their own analysis out of it. So I just put that in there just for show and effect. But the proposals are quite simple. They're quite similar to research papers. So you have an abstract. So for me, it was research overview. Essentially, it's a summary. Objectives. So the supervisor knows, okay, I thought about things methodically. Methodology. So this is just equipment to kind of see, does my plan fit with what the lab has? Is it feasible? And then research impact and significance. And this is where it shines to say that actually I've looked around, I've identified a gap, and this is where this significance would lie with your lab. That should be relatively simple to do because most PIs will have some sort of abstract on the university webpage or department webpage, and that will highlight what they're doing, what their papers are, any publications they have, and you should kind of be able to slot yourself into that quite nicely. And then just a few references I had at the end, I think, as well. And the potential funding as well. Because if you're proposing an idea, the chances are there's no funding attached to it. You have to apply externally. So I also put in 2 lines where we could potentially get funding. It didn't take me that long, but I would say make sure you get someone to proofread it, because what might look very simple to you, someone else will read it and be like, that makes no sense. You abbreviate something that isn't a thing. But yeah, very similar to what Neil did. Look at projects, submitted it. I think I submitted to about 5 people. It's a very similar project. The person that replied to me first was the person I wanted to work with and did my PhD with, so I was quite fortunate that way. And then I had a quick interview, about 30 minutes over Zoom, and then just kind of steamrolled from there. So that was it. And I'll speak about funding later on, how I did that.
Yeah. So thanks, Jas. And yeah, you can see from here that although it looks complicated, and you might say that, oh, I don't know any methodology. I'm a clinician or I'm just a student. How am I going to write a method section? You don't need every individual experiment written down. You need a broad overview of what you think you're going to do, and you can always look through the literature and see people who've done similar things to what you want to do, and look at how they've done it, and incorporate that in your PhD proposal. And then you can put that as a reference as well. And that really makes it shine. It'll show the supervisor that you've read through, like, you've not just randomly invented this thing. There's a scientific foundation for it. So if we move on to the next slide, that's a bit more to do with interview tips, which Jas and Michelle are going to talk about. So I'll just open these up.
Okie dokie. So in terms of the interview, so my process for my application was a little bit different to Jas and Neil's. I applied to a project which was already funded. The project title was already given, and there was already a 3 to 4 year plan because it was an industrially sponsored project. And so for my interview, I was interviewed by a couple of PIs in the department, talking just through some of my previous research. And again, it's a conversation, it's not a grilling. So they asked me why I went a particular way in my research. Why did I not run this experiment over this experiment? How would I take it further? How would I criticize my own work? How can industry get involved in my research and take it further? Things like that. So it's a very technical interview, which happens for a PhD. But the thing that I really wanted to focus on for the interview part isn't the questions that you're going to get asked, but the questions that you should ask your future lab and your future PI. So one big thing which I really hope every single PI does during an interview is that they leave you alone with current members of the lab. So that gives you an opportunity to ask about the lab without the PI standing over you, so you don't feel pressured to ask particular things that you might be scared of asking in front of them. And that gives you an opportunity to really find out what the current lab members really think about the PI, whether they're good to work with, are they easy to get hold of? Some students won't see their PIs for months, other students will see their PIs every 2 weeks. So that's very important to know how often you'll meet with them. And then also get a vibe of the lab. So be shown around the lab, see all the different equipment, and talk to current members about their own research and what they do on a day-to-day basis. So it's important to find out what you yourself will be doing on a day-to-day basis. Will you be running the same experiment over and over again every day, or are you going to be given the opportunity to branch out and learn lots of different techniques from lots of different people. Also finding out who will be in charge of your day-to-day supervision within the lab. Are there postdocs in the lab? That's very important as well. Or is it just PhD students in the lab? Having postdocs in the lab is very valuable, as that's where your supervision, your everyday supervision is going to come from, and that's who's going to teach you all the different techniques and how to troubleshoot things if things go wrong. And then the lab dynamic as well, whether people work together on different projects or everyone's very separate, what people's working hours are, how often we meet as a lab, if we have lab meetings every week, every other week, and journal clubs, and just the social sides of things as well, because all of these things you might not think of, but this is what you're going to be doing every day. And these are the people that you're going to be with every day. So it's very important to try and get a feel of the lab and how that is. And then in terms of research opportunities, it's good to ask perhaps how many other PhD students your supervisor has supervised in the past, and then you can gain an idea of how experienced they are and how frequently the students in the lab publish, where do they publish to, who do they work with, are there different collaborations either within academia or within industry, and those sorts of things are all really important in the interview. So not just having the supervisor ask you about you, but also you asking the lab and the members about their work as well, and just seeing how you're going to fit in. And in big bold letters, we have ask about funding, which I'll let the others talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I say ask about funding, and that actually takes us on to the next bit, applying for funding. And we'll go through two different more common venues, and then Jas is going to talk about how he funded his PhD, because that was crazy. So to start with, there's, like I said, two main areas. So the first one is societies, and you might be thinking, what's a society? Well, they're kind of almost charity groups set up who have money to provide to researchers looking to carry out a project that's within the remit of that society. So you have Cancer Research UK, for example. That's a society that provides funding for cancer research. So they can fund you in different ways. They can fund the course itself. So there's special courses that are fully funded that you can directly apply to, which doesn't go through the whole emailing supervisors. It's just a course you apply for, like the BBSRC DTP program in Cambridge. And so the funding's all there for that. You don't need to stress too much. But the disadvantage is it's only for home students that can apply for some of these courses, although there are some open to internationals as well. But they can also fund a lab through grants. So, and a lot of these grants have funding for PhD candidates, which is why it's so important to ask your supervisor whether they hold one of these grants and whether it already has funding for a PhD student, because that's your ideal situation where you've knocked off your PhD interview and your funding all in one go. It's a bit rare, but you should definitely ask your supervisor. And the last bit is a few common societies that you might be able to look around at and see what sorts of funding they had. So how Jas was saying, he included some places where they could get funding for his project, the one he proposed. You can look at some of these societies and see whether what you're planning to do falls into one of their criteria, and then you could suggest that as a grant to get funding for your project. So some of the ones people may have heard of are the CRUC, so Cancer Research UK, and the Wellcome Trust, which give out huge amounts of money for different types of research. There are other funded courses as well called 1+3 programs, where it's 4 years and you get a master's and a PhD along with it, and they're usually funded by societies as well. But all of this you can find, like we said in one of the previous slides, directly from university websites. But you can also look at the society websites themselves, because they may offer PhDs that might not directly be based in a university, but in a research institution like the Crick Institute. So that's one way of funding. The other way is actual scholarships, and there's different types of them. So there's the scholarships provided by the university itself, and they're usually they're opportunities for both home and international students. So it's quite lucky. For PhDs and masters, there's international students do get funding from the university, depending on which university you apply for, but most tend to have these options available. I put some examples there. I wanted to put a list of all of them, but they're constantly changing, and their monetary values change as well. So it wasn't really feasible. But for example, I was on the Harding Scholarship, And I was lucky that my scholarship had a small consumables fund that came along with it, which a lot of these scholarships don't come with. So that's another reason why it's so important to ask your supervisor during the interview whether they have funding, because you might be able to get funding for your university fees through the university, but that's still not enough, which is why it's so difficult, because you need money to actually buy the material you need to do your experiments with on a day-to-day basis. So it's best if the supervisor has funding for that, or you could look to a society for a lab grant to get some of that as well. And then there's also country-specific scholarships, which apply. I intended this more as for international students, if there's any of you among us, because we know it's super expensive for international students to come abroad to the UK to do a PhD or even a master's. And countries tend to offer some scholarships. For example, the Commonwealth countries offer this thing called the Commonwealth Scholarship, where you just apply for it and you have to provide evidence that you're going to improve life in your home country when applying for it. But there's quite a few of them available, and it's for masters and PhD. So there's definitely, you should look into what your country has to offer as a scholarship. And a lot of these country-specific scholarships are also advertised by the university. So just scour the university website for funding options, for supervisors, for available projects and PhDs. All of that is through the university website itself. And yeah, so every university has their little niche scholarships. Like Cambridge, for example, has colleges, and each college also has mini scholarships for people. And those are constantly changing. So it's good to look at those options as well. There's a secret third option to fund your PhD or master's, which Jazz did. So I'm going to hand over now to Jazz, just for him to give us his story.
Yeah, just before I do that, with Neil was mentioning about colleges in Oxbridge, there's some funding that's locked to certain demographics. So if you're from a certain background, certain ethnicity, or you're doing certain subjects, they are locked to that. So do look into those, because they won't be as competitive, because they only target a small amount of people. But it does offer quite a good grant, and it means you'll be linked to a college, which is quite nice. So the third option, which is not very feasible for most people, but as this audience is healthcare related, and most of you will probably be professionals by the time you do PhDs, you probably could be viable. And that also, you need to be a home student for this to work, is that there's the postdoctoral loan. So it's through Student Finance England. So same as you would do an undergrad degree, and you get student finance loans. Basically, it pays for your tuition fees, and then you just have to kind of sort out how you're going to do maintenance. So that's your living costs. And as I'm a pharmacist, that wasn't too bad. But it just meant that where most people would have their weekends, I would be working in a pharmacy to like pay my rent and food, which is fine and it works. But as I say, that's not really an option most people can do. But if you're a doctor or a dentist, probably a nurse as well, chances are if you're locoming, you could probably get away with that. However, I do stress that you do want the time, because if you want to try and get involved in societies, meet friends, just kind of get involved with university lifestyle, you probably don't want to be kind of wasting your weekends or evenings away working when you don't really need to. So that is an option if you're really interested in a lab and your project's good, and money isn't too much of a problem, and you've kind of budgeted okay. Chances are you could probably do what I did, but don't if you can.
Yeah, thanks, Jazz. Yeah, so he took quite a different route, and yeah, it is difficult, and you lose a bit of that university experience, like he was saying. So not recommended, but definitely still possible. And I know for healthcare professionals actually going to research, there's also NIHR funding, which we'll talk about more in the next webinar, where we have our consultant anesthetist coming in, and he did a PhD while doing clinical training. So hopefully a lot of questions we haven't answered right now, he'll talk about then. So yeah, for a lot of these scholarships, you need a separate personal statement to show why you deserve the scholarship, pretty much, and how you're going to benefit the world, because that's what people want to give money for, is if you do something that improves lives, which everyone here hopefully wants to do. And yeah, so I'm going to have a look through the chat now. We've gone through actually pretty quickly. and we'll answer some questions and then go on to the post-webinar Mentimeter quiz. So just post us something, whatever you want to ask, in the chat box right now. So we have a question. I'll just read it out loud. I'm looking to apply for a master's program. I have minimal experience in the research field, but I have knowledge of clinical research in general. How can I strengthen my application in order to be shortlisted for programs? And in order to get an entry into a specialty training program, is one type of research better than the other, course-based versus thesis-based? Okay. Is the funding only reserved for thesis-based research programs and PhDs, or is funding available for course-based research programs as well? Okay, so a few questions within that one big question. It doesn't matter if you have minimal experience in the research field. To strengthen your application for your master's program that you want to apply for, play on your strengths. So explain your knowledge of clinical research, because research is research at the end of the day. There are transferable skills throughout all the different types of research, like data analysis, experimental design, things like that. So if you include all of that in your personal statement and show how maybe if you designed an experiment or you figured out a way to analyze the data, or what bits of the research you were involved in, that would really strengthen your application. In speaking about specialty training programs, it would be better if you attend the next webinar where the speaker who has more experience with specialty training programs can talk about. But I don't believe there is too much of a difference between course-based and thesis-based, just from my current knowledge. But course-based research programs tend to be more masters, whereas thesis-based, there are thesis-based masters, so MRes, and research-based masters, but those are mainly those masters and PhDs as well. So of course, some are going to give you more of an edge because they're longer, they take more time, and they're a lot more difficult. And the last bit of your question, is funding reserved for thesis-based or course-based programs? So for master's funding, it applies to pretty much all masters, but you should always check depending on the scholarship or funding you're applying for, because some of them do have some restrictions. For example, if your master's program doesn't fall within the remit of a society, they, regardless of what type of master's it is, they might not really want to fund it. Whereas the one I did, the scholarship I had, were happy to fund course-based or research or thesis-based programs. And also there are some PhDs which are slightly more structured, like the 1+3 program that I was mentioning, and those are all fully funded. So there is funding for course-based research programs as well. It's just about looking to see what you can find. So are there any more questions? I'll give it a couple of minutes. People are shy. If you have any more questions.
I can add to what Neil said. So when I submitted my CV, there was a section, I called it a skills section, and in there I put laboratory techniques. So I just went through my undergrad laboratory book and just picked techniques that were relevant to the project I was submitting. So, everyone would have done laboratory experiments, but just like listing some of the key words just makes it easier for the PI to say, okay, like he kind of knows what he's doing, like he knows these phrases, and also it kind of jogs your memory. So when you do have the interview, you can kind of pluck these things out and say, oh yeah, I did this experiment, and just elongate it. And regarding the ST program, so I want to go into industry, and so I work as a clinical trials pharmacist. So my PhD project was preclinical studies, essentially where it was. So if you kind of have a rough idea what you want to go do, whether that's like be a principal or chief investigator in trials, if that's like your long-term goal, you can probably like gear a program towards that, and that way in the future you can kind of use that as a backbone. But that would be my advice for that.
Great. Okay, so another couple of questions here. Are there PhDs based on clinical research for overseas doctors? Yeah, there definitely are. It's all about just finding them. And you can do that once again through university websites, because a lot of clinical researchers are sort of tethered to a particular university. But it would also be good to look through your NHS Trust website, because they have the current research that the trust is carrying out and who to contact. Even if it doesn't say that they're taking PhD students, it's a good idea to just email them, because chances are they'll be happy to take you. Everyone need some help with research. So PIs are usually quite open to take on a student. Next one, if a master's involves a dissertation, do you recommend completing a systematic review or a primary research study? And would you say masters enable you to do whatever research topic you want as long as it's related to the masters? Michelle, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Okay. So all masters will involve you having to write a dissertation at the end of it. It depends what your intentions are coming out of the masters. So if you wish to complete a PhD after the masters, then I highly, highly recommend doing a wet lab based research project, as you will then have months and months and months of experience and expertise, which you can then use to apply for your PhD. Whereas if you're just completing a master's because you want to have a further understanding and in a specific field, then doing either a primary research study or a systematic review, I'm sure will be fine. However, it is unlikely for a master's dissertation that you will be able to complete a systematic review. It's going to most likely be a primary research area or question that you've come up with that you have to look into. A systematic review, I'd say, is more of an undergraduate or a bachelor's research project. So that's the first bit. And then say masters enable you to do whatever research topics you want as long as it's related to the masters. So that's up to the supervisor that you apply with. So if you're doing an MRes, I'm sure if you talk to the supervisor will have an idea of what the project area would be. For example, it might be in inflammation, in osteoarthritis, in a specific cell type. But if you discuss with the supervisor a specific way that you want it to go, particular techniques that you want to use in the lab, then you'll be able to have some flexibility around the topic that it is. Whereas in a lecture-based 50-50 masters, there will be a list of topics that you'll choose from, and you will be limited to those research titles rather than doing whichever research topic that you want. I hope that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And just the last couple of questions really quickly. Did you halt medical work to do your PhDs, and how did the logistics work? So neither of us can answer that question very well because neither of us halted medical work, but from experience with my colleagues that I've talked to, you can do it either way. So one of my colleagues in a research project a while ago, he was a registrar at the time and was doing clinics alongside his medical work. And he'll talk a bit more about that in the next webinar. But we also know medical professionals who've done their PhD as an out of program opportunity, and then come back later on. But the logistics of that is easier to ask the speaker in the next webinar, directly related to clinical research. Differences between scholarships, studentships, and fellowships. Scholarships and studentships are very similar. They're usually directly offered by the university or some sort of funding body, and fellowships are more from grants that you apply for and you get funding for, and then you're called a fellow of the grant. But a lot of the times these words are used interchangeably. Right?
And I think a fellowship's also more often attributed to postdoc positions, because then you become a fellow, as Neil said, of that particular funding body, and it also comes often with teaching responsibilities and that sort of thing. So you'll be a fellow of a place and an academic under that position, doing not only your own research but also teaching and other things like that.
Yeah, so with fellowships, you tend to be established at a certain level. So chances are you will have to be a postdoc. I would recommend trying to get into studentships. They tend to be doctoral training programs or BBSRCs. They're regarded as studentships because they're quite a substantial program, and they're quite bulked out with a lot of extra stuff that you don't tend to get, whether that's visiting other countries or visiting other labs doing projects, whereas scholarships tend to be just a lump of money that's just given. And you want something that's more substantial because you'll gain way more from it.
Okay, and the last question, interview tips, I think, or general topics people tend to ask about. I think what we said earlier about just reading around the field and just having the names of a few papers that are relevant to your field or the master's or PhD you're applying for is the best prep you can do. But if interview tips is something people are struggling with, we can organize another webinar, like a focus group type thing, where we do some practice interviews and go through some questions that they may ask. And lastly, will NHS cover master's scholarships if the master's was after medical school? So I would save that question for our speaker in the next webinar, because I can't directly answer that one. And I'm so sorry to cut short on time, but we'll stop with the questions for now and just go on to the final mentor. So yeah, if you just join in, we'll give it a couple more minutes for people to join in, and we'll see if we actually learned something today. Hopefully we did. Okay, so we'll get started, and it's the same rules as before. Answer what you think is the best answer, even though all of the options may be correct. Okay, so let's begin. And again, you have 10 seconds once the answer options appear on the screen. Well, would you look at that? Good work, guys. Really good work. So next one. Excellent. Yeah. So you would ask about all of them, but I would still say funding is the most important one that you should really ask about. And last one. Yeah. Perfect. Sorry, Jas, to throw shade at how you did it, but yeah, we wouldn't really recommend that. Great. So just do the final end slide. So thank you all so much for joining. And if you want to sign up, I think a lot of you would be interested in the second webinar. That's the first QR code. And you also please do provide feedback so we can see how to improve for you guys for the next few webinars, and whether you want any additional classes or focus groups or sort of interview tip sessions that might be helpful. If you give us that information in the feedback, we can really tailor how we run this program in the future. And yeah, I'll leave this open for a couple of minutes, but you'll also get updates on this directly from MedAll, and you can see on the Mind the Bleep Facebook group, you'll get updates on future webinars as well. So stay tuned for those. So I'll give it to about a couple of minutes, and then we'll end the meeting. Thank you for staying so much over time. Very kind of all of you. So there's just a question saying, which webinar will cover NHS funding? That'll be the doing a degree during clinical training webinar. So if you sign up for that one, you'll get all the top tips for being a clinical PhD student. Okay, great. So we'll finish off there. Thank you again, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you. Bye, guys.